Hi, everyone. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and welcome to my channel. Today, we're going to be discussing What Is It Like to Be a Bat by Thomas Nagel. This was published in 1974 in the Philosophical Review. And basically, this paper is about the problem of consciousness and its relationship to the mind body problem. These things are very much related. He says in the first line, consciousness is what makes the mind body problem really intractable. And then not too long down the way, he says, without consciousness, the mind body problem would be much less interesting. With consciousness, it seems hopeless. Yeah, and the mind body problem is the problem of connecting what happens mentally to what happens physically, right? To try to understand and give an explanation of how these two things connect, the mental world and the physical world. And he says consciousness is what makes this really difficult. And at this point in the paper, he hasn't given an idea of what consciousness is, but he assumes we all have some sort of concept in our mind of what that is. But in this paper, one of the things that's really nice is Thomas Nagel gives a what I would call a working definition of what we should be thinking about when we talk about consciousness, and it's the subjective character of our experience. But he says it in the following way: consciousness is the fact that there is something that it is like to be me, for instance, or that there is something that it is like to be a bat. And that's what it is as a working definition. That's what it is that we're trying to explain when we think about the problem of consciousness and the mind body problem and how these things are related. And it's worth thinking for a second about um, what philosophy is trying to do in general. Here, a lot of times what philosophy is trying to do is clarify and be more precise about what something is. And so, in particular, one of the goals of philosophy of consciousness is to clarify and be more precise about what consciousness is, right? To hone in our intuitions about these things. If that's the project of philosophy, then that means, well, first of all, we have to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. If we can't give a precise definition, then we need at least something to get us in the same ballpark so that we're not talking past each other. So something like a working definition, which you can't hold my feet to the fire and ask me to be super precise. If I could, I would have already done it, right? And so, but having something a little less precise, but gets us in the same ballpark is a really valuable thing to start us off. And then again, the goal of philosophy is to try to get that definition to be more precise, to hone in our intuitions, to ask good questions about it, and to point out how other theories or other definitions have gone wrong in some way by some thought experiment or argument, right? So, anyway, we need a working definition, and I think this is a really good working definition that it is like something to be a bat, or that it is like something to be me, or that it is like something to be someone else is a nice way of getting us in the right ballpark of what we're trying to understand better in this particular philosophical discussion. And one of the things he wants to be critical of, though he's not going to completely reject in this paper, is like the typical reductionist account or the reductionist desire to try to reduce consciousness down to something much simpler. And of course, one way you can try to do that is to just reduce consciousness down to physical processes, some kind of physicalism or materialism. And it should be clear from the very beginning, or I want to be clear from the very beginning, because Thomas Nagel never tries to completely reject physicalism or materialism. His goal here is not to say that that's impossible. His goal instead is to challenge the community to do a better job of explaining how a reduction might even be possible, right? So I think this paper is more of a is more of a challenge to the physicalist than it is a refutation. He's never going to try to refute it, but he does want to try to sharpen things up a little bit and challenge the reductionist to think more clearly about what it would even look like to try to reduce consciousness down to physical states, physical processes. So he has this quote that I like in the beginning. Every reductionist has his favorite analogy from modern science. It is most unlikely that any of these unrelated examples of successful reduction will shed light on the relation of mind to brain. But philosophers share the general human weakness for explanations of what is incomprehensible in terms suited for what is familiar and well understood, though entirely different. So his point here is that you can paint all kinds of analogies about how reductions have worked in science all you want. And you're not wrong. Reductions have worked in science. He's not denying that. He's just saying just because you paint an analogy doesn't make your argument any stronger than it was before. If reductions are have a fundamental issue or are fundamentally different when it comes to consciousness, then the analogy doesn't really say much. I mean, you can use the analogy to say, hey, that's the idea I have. Let's try to work on that idea. But to do anything more with the analogy is to go too far, I think, in his point. And I think he's right about that. He says like later on that, the physicalist has to give some idea of how, just even conceptually how, even if you can't completely explain, can you give just some idea of how something mental could be explained by something physical? Can you give some idea of how this can be done? And he points out later how so often when we reduce things down, we go from the more subjective to the more objective, right? When it comes to science, we go from observations that I make with my eyes, which in some sense are subjective. They come from my subjective experience. And then we reduce things down and make it more and more objective. The more we study it, the more um, experiments that we do. We go from the sort of the subjective experiences that we collect, and then we reduce them down, understand them better, and make them more and more objective. But he points out in the paper how this is quite difficult to do in the case of consciousness because the thing you're trying to explain itself is subjective, and hence it doesn't make sense to try to reduce things down to the more objective things, since the very thing you're trying to explain is subjective. Okay, I've gotten a little ahead of myself, but that is a big part of the paper. Let me read a part that I consider to be his thesis at this point in the paper. I do not deny that conscious mental states and events cause behavior, nor that they may be given functional characterizations. I deny only that this kind of thing exhausts their analysis. Any reductionist program has to be based on an analysis of what it is to be reduced. If the analysis leaves something out, the problem will be falsely posed. It is useless to base the defense of materialism on any analysis of mental phenomena that fails to deal explicitly with their subjective character. For there is no reason to suppose that a reduction which seems plausible when no attempt is made to account for consciousness can be extended to include consciousness. Without some idea, therefore, of what the subjective character of experiences is, we cannot know what is required of a physicalist theory. Okay, that's a big part of what he's going to argue in this paper. He says, not too many lines later, if physicalism is to be defended, the phenomenological features must themselves be given a physical account. And phenomenology is the philosophy of experience. So that's what he's getting at when he uses the word phenomenological there. Uh, and, again, this is something that's well known in philosophy, this issue between you can describe sort of something what we call the being in itself, like the what we usually think of like the scientific characteristics of something or the physical characteristics of something. And again, how do we connect those up with the conscious experience of what it is like to be me, the subjective experience that I have? That's the mind body problem, right? How do I make the connections between those two things? And then to try to sharpen up why this is so difficult, he points to two different analogies here. Well, first of all, um, let's just take a little bit of a detour to solipsism for a second. Technically, I don't know that any other human being has consciousness, right? I know I have something like consciousness. I know I have some experience of what it's like to be me. And if we want to be like really strict about it, we can try to strip that down to like the very core of what I can be absolutely certain of. But let's just leave it at that. I know I have some experience of what it is like to be me. I don't know for sure that other human beings have some experience of what it's like to be them. That being said, these other human beings are similar enough to me. They look similar enough to me. They behave similar enough to me. They report similar enough things to me. And so it's reasonable for me to assume that I'm having a conscious experience and probably they are having conscious experiences too. And also, along with that, it's reasonable for me to try to understand what their subjective experiences might be like by taking my own subjective experiences and trying to combine them in certain ways, or doing thought experiments about my own experiences and how it might relate to their experiences, so on and so forth. It makes some reasonable sense to do that in order to get some understanding of what their subjective experience is like. Okay, but then if we go to the thought experiment of a bat, and now this kind of breaks down because I, first of all, I don't have the same sort of perceptual apparatuses that a bat has, and I don't fly around like a bat does, so I don't even have the same physical experiences or in that sense. And also, I just have no ability to project my own experiences onto the bat. I mean, I can try, but I have little or less reason to believe that my subjective experiences are somehow similar enough to the bat's subjective experience so that I can actually do something meaningful when I project my experiences onto the bat, right? Unlike other people, I seem to think that I have some good reason to believe that I can project my experiences onto them, and if I'm creative enough and careful enough about how I do that, I might actually be able to understand something about what they experience. In the case of a bat, it seems quite unlikely that we can do that, right? And here he's pointing to a lot of limitations. Um, Let me read a passage here. I want to know what it is like for a bat to be a bat. Yet, if I try to imagine this, I am restricted to the resources of my own mind, and those resources are inadequate to the task. I cannot perform it either by imagining additions to my present experience, or by imagining segments gradually subtracted from it, or by imagining some combination of additions, subtractions, and modifications. Right. So, this here he's talking about basically this is how we try to imagine what other humans' experiences are like, by just kind of like combining, adding, subtracting, modifying our own experiences in some way and getting some picture. But we don't expect that to necessarily be um, useful to trying to understand what it's like to be a bat. He also talks about the subjective character of the experience of a person deaf and blind from birth is not accessible to me, for example, nor presumably is mine to him. This does not prevent us each from believing that the other's experience has such a subjective character. So again, we still seem to be in a reasonable place to assume that the bat has some conscious experience. We don't know this for sure, but it seems like we're at least reasonable in assuming that there is something it is like to be a bat. It's just to go beyond and actually try to say what that is like is the difficult part, and maybe we can't say anything like that. In fact, he goes into this whole discussion of like the limitations of human concepts, right? Like our language is based off in some part our experiences, and he goes on to challenge like what can we actually say. And there's this one part that I don't quite agree with, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, but let me read it. Reflection on what it is like to be a bat seems to lead us, therefore, to the conclusion that there are facts that do not consist in the truth of propositions expressible in a human language. We can be compelled to recognize the existence of such facts without being able to state or comprehend them. Here, I have just a subtle objection, and maybe I'm not even actually disagreeing with Nagel. I'm just slightly misunderstanding what he's saying. But I agree with him that like so he's saying that like we can agree that probably a bat has a subjective experience, has something what it is like to be a bat. And he points out that we may never be able to express it in human language. This I completely agree with. But he also seems to be saying that it may not be possible to express in human language, which I also agree. But there is a distinction I want to make. It's possible that as humans, we will never be able to express what it is like to be a bat. That doesn't mean that our language is not capable of expressing it, right? So I don't know if this is, maybe people would say this is not that important of a distinction, But I do think there's an interesting distinction there. It's possible that you can describe what it is like to be bat in our language, but we will never actually do that description because we will never have the adequate um, exposure to that experience to actually be able to express it, right? But those are two different things. And I'm sure Thomas Nagel would be, I suspect that he would be completely fine with that distinction. Okay, but now he goes on to talk more about the objective and subjective distinctions here, and and in particular when it comes to phenomenological facts or facts of experience. Here he says there is a sense in which phenomenological facts are perfectly objective. One person can know or say of another what the quality of the other's experiences is. They are subjective, however, in the sense that even this objective ascription of experience is possible only for someone sufficiently similar to the object of ascription to be able to adopt his point of view, to understand the ascription in the first place, person as well as in the third, so to speak. So again, this is what I was talking about before, where I can have something like an objective description of other humans' subjective experience, but in order to do that, I have to have to believe that I have similar enough subjective experiences, and that's not the case when it comes to a bat. And he's going to go on to distinguish between scientific facts and phenomenological facts, which I feel like I've already kind of talked about a little bit. And you can read the paper if you want to get more into that specifically. Here, I'll read this quote. It is difficult to understand what could be meant by the objective character of an experience apart from the particular point of view from which its subject apprehends it. After all, what would be left of it was like to be a bat if one removed the viewpoint of the bat, right? So he's trying to say that consciousness is inherently subjective. And if you try to remove the subjectivity of it, then you've removed the thing you're trying to describe completely, right? Like, after all, what would it be left of what it is like to be a bat if one removed the viewpoint of the bat completely, right? I think this is an important point. He's sharpening up our intuitions from what makes this problem so difficult. It is inherently subjective from the start. So, and again, this is where he points out that usually reductions move from the more subjective to the more objective in science and things like that, as I pointed out earlier. But in the consciousness, that's not the case. And so as we move on to the end of the paper, his goal is going to be to challenge us to describe what that reduction could look like, right? And again, he's not denying that a reduction is impossible. He's just saying that if you believe a reduction is possible, then try to work and think about giving me some way of understanding why that would be possible. Let me read this quote as well. If we acknowledge that a physical theory of mind must account for the subjective character of experience, we must admit that no presently available conception gives us a clue how this could be done. The problem is unique. If mental processes are indeed physical processes, then there is something it is like intrinsically to undergo certain physical processes. What is it for such a thing to be the case remains a mystery. Here, Nagel is not trying to talk about panpsychism, but this part reminds me a little bit of panpsychism, that which is this idea that perhaps consciousness itself is somehow like a fundamental physical law. And when we go to reduce things down, perhaps one of the things we reduce things down to is like little bits of consciousness or something like that. I'm going to keep it a little bit vague. My goal here is not to give you a lecture on panpsychism, but you can look it up. And, the point is that you have to, if you're going to try to reduce things down to physical things, then you have to somehow say what it's like, um, what this subjective experience is like in terms of physical processes. And if you think that that's impossible, then you might give up and say, you know what, instead, I'm going to say that there is some fundamental, consciousness bits, little bits of consciousness that is what you reduce things down to in combination with physical things. And in the combination of like these physical atoms and, these, you know the what you reduce physics down to in combination with what you're going to reduce consciousness down, these little bits of consciousness, those fundamental things together can explain the mind body problem. Is a rough idea of what panpsychism is trying to do. So again, I don't want to get into panpsychism any more than I have already, but it is worth, I think, bringing up in the sense that um, when you think about reducing things down, that is an option that people play with here as a way of reducing things down. Okay, so what else do we have here? Um, he talks about how at the present time, the status of physicalism is similar to that which the hypothesis that matter is energy would have had if uttered by a pre-Socratic philosopher, right? It's like we don't even have a good conceptual basis for understanding how, um, consciousness could be a physical process. And that's a big part of what you have to do, right? Um, but he says that he does think that there is a reasonable reason to think that it could be done. It's not that he thinks it's impossible. He just thinks that there needs to be more work done. And so I'll just read this last paragraph to finish out the discussion. Apart from its own interest, a phenomenology that is in this sense objective may permit questions about the physical basis of experience to assume a more intelligible form. Aspects of subjective experience that emitted this kind of objective description might be better candidates for objective explanations of a more familiar sort. But whether or not this guess is correct, it seems unlikely that any physical theory of mind can be contemplated until more thought has been given to the general problem of subjective and objective. Otherwise, we cannot even pose the mind-body problem without sidestepping it. So again, this paper I think ends with a challenge to the community. If you think the the physicalist theory is correct, great. But now you have some work to do, and Nagel has sort of sharpened up what he thinks is the thing you need to work on, and you need to give some idea of how you can reduce down physical processes in order to explain something subjective. So check out the paper. I hope you appreciated this discussion. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you at another video.